My questions are going to be focused on when you spend money like this bill does, what kind of return on investment are you going to get from it? The pro forma from the CBO says that we'll be spending $80 billion over 10 years, and we're going to be generating $180 billion. So you divide that net by 10 years, it's $10 billion a year. So I want to go back to the chart that I think is most important. Senator Johnson had it here earlier, is the stubbornness in our current system of regardless of what you do based upon tax rate, we end up over 63 years here generating basically the same percentage of our GDP in revenue. To me, that should be the given that we're dealing with here. And of course, we're currently running $2 trillion deficits annually. The White House has put out $42 trillion to be in debt in 5 years, 52 in 10 years. So this is a rounding error in terms of what it's going to do to save money. That, I think, is a given, and that is a very small percentage of our total problem. And then I want to talk about the trajectory of where we've come from just a short time I've been here, where we had structuralized trillion-dollar deficits annually, and now we structuralized trillion-dollar deficits every 6 months. So we've got issues that go way beyond.
Senator Braun, can I just interject for 1 second on a matter of committee business? I've got to get to the Finance Committee now. Senator Kaine has kindly agreed to close the committee. So you have your time, and my apologies for interrupting, but I wanted to let everybody know what's happening here and that Senator Kaine will be taking over the gavel for the remainder of the hearing.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I'd like to hear from all the witnesses what we really do to fix the problem. This is not something that it's going to measure in any way. And even when you look at the impact from the tax cuts of 2017, that was pro forma'd at $150 billion per year over 10 years, $1.5 trillion. The CPO, which I was working with them, was getting very close to showing that when you do lower rates, you put a little less into the Treasury out of the gate, but then economic growth has to be taken into consideration. So what are the ways that we actually get our budget back in order? Set this aside because it's a rounding error in terms of what it's going to do or won't do. I'd love to hear ideas on how we get our hands around something that is going to explode over the next 5 and 10 years. And this is not going to make any difference. And it's an estimation, too. There's no guarantee that we'll even get those savings. I'll start here with Mr. Edwards and then go across the panel.
So I agree with what you're saying there. I think that increasing enforcement on high-end folks, maybe you triple or quadruple the auditing, you maybe get 10 or 20 more billion a year, but that's only 1% of the federal deficit. In my view, we need large spending cuts. I suggested some spending cuts in my testimony. For entitlements, let's at least start with cutting benefits like Social Security just for the very high end. There's no reason why Bill Gates needs to get Social Security. We can't afford that anymore. And secondly, I would say that we have to revive federalism in this country. Federal government spends over $1 trillion a year subsidizing state and local governments. I mean, the ACA match for Medicaid is a 90% match. We can't afford that anymore. Let's cut back these matching payments to the states. In my view, get the federal government out of areas like K-12 education that the states are really responsible. So reviving federalism, I think, is in a very important way to get the deficit down.
Because the current deficit that we're running, it was like 20 cents on every dollar we were spending just 5 years ago. Now it's 30 cents. It's jumped from $1 trillion a year to $2 trillion. So something's got to give on the level of spending, because that, since the Biden administration has taken over, defies any ability to generate revenue that would come close to the levels that we're spending at. Do you agree with that?
As you know, we're in a death spiral now because the deficit of $2 trillion is going up and up and up. Long-term government borrowing rates gone up to 5%, and I don't see any forecast for interest rates going down. Rising interest rates, high debt and deficit, it's kind of a death spiral. We've seen what happens in other countries, and we've got to avoid that here.
So, Dr. Hendren, would you agree that anything to do with what this might do, say it's at $10 billion a year, is insignificant compared to the broader issue that we just spend way more than we can ever expect to take in?
So I don't want to understate the size of the problems that are faced with the budget in the United States, but I also don't think we should understate the size of the return to additional IRS audits. As I was saying at the outset of my remarks, every dollar that we spend there gets us back $12 over the long run. And I think we share, as you were suggesting, the idea that when we think about trying to raise revenue, we should do it in the way that has the least distortionary cost. And by our estimates, expanded audits, yes, on top earners is a more efficient way of raising that marginal dollar right now than changing.
But it is also nearly insignificant as a percentage of the total issue. Would you agree with that?
So I think, you can't audit more than the amount.
So you're saying every $10 billion counts, it's going to somehow lead to where we'd get rid of the $2 trillion deficits annually?
I think the math would not work out that if you just tried to close the deficit with just audits. I think that would be difficult. However, I do think that we should think about the marginal return on an additional dollar in there. I think audits look quite good.
And then do you have any suggestions on what we do structurally to live within what appears to be a very stubborn amount of revenue that we can generate in our current system, regardless of the tax rate, regardless of how much you'd audit?
Yeah, I guess I would be a little bit less pessimistic about the graph that you guys are showing with the percent of tax revenue of GDP going from 0 to 100 on the same graph. I think that's not very well emphasizing the changes in the tax revenue we can actually get. But I do think that there is, more that one would have to do beyond just audits in order to close the structural deficit. I think that's right, but I feel like I'd hope that we'd take the same level of kind of principled analysis.
Maybe like not spending more than you take in?
I think, look, I'm an economist. I'm happy to give you the budget constraint as a principle for us to think about. But I think what we should think about is for every dollar we spend, what's the bang for the buck that we get on that?
Dr. Sarin, what do you think of the modern monetary theory, where all of this just makes no difference in that we can go into the future on the trajectory we're at now? Stick with that theory.
I deeply disagree with that theory, and I share your deep concern that we're on a fiscally unsustainable path. Debt to GDP ratios are going to rise to at least 119% of GDP over the next decade and significantly more over the next 3 decades unless we come up with real solutions. And I would be keen to work with you on them. I just want to emphasize that I actually think, like Dr. Hendren does, that tax and tax reform can be a very substantial part of that solution.
It's going to be $10 billion a year. Do you have any other ideas in terms of what we do other than just quit spending more than we take in?
So, Senator Braun, I want to emphasize that my estimates and Dr. Hendren's estimates are that over the course of a decade, by adequately funding the IRS, you can generate $500 billion. And so that's
not according to the CBO.
That's pretty significant revenue. And the reason for the differences between us and CBO has to do with the fact that taxpayer behavior adjusts in ways that are really important and aren't reflected in CBO's estimates. But I want to say that there are other things that you can do as well. And in fact, Kim Klossing and I put together a tax reform proposal that we hope to talk to you about ahead of 2025 that calls for around $3.5 trillion of new revenue raising that can come from things like equalizing the tax burden faced by capital and labor, international tax reform, corporate tax reform that have the potential to raise really substantial revenue and help us deal with our growing debts and deficits.
And you don't think that would be a wet blanket on the economy?
I actually don't. The estimates of sort of the impact of TCJA on investment are that investment went up, but very, very insignificantly relative to the revenue cost associated with decreasing the corporate tax rate from 35% to 21%. And so I do think that there is really substantial scope here for us to think seriously about revenue raising in ways that are pro-growth, not anti-growth.
Thank you.
Dr. Sarin, I wanted to come back to you on the questions